All right, chapter 15 is the last chapter in our book, and it talks about communicating the findings and completing the project. And we're going to learn about presenting research findings, tables and graphs, oral presentations, ethical considerations, and then some guidelines for storing data. So there are variations in audiences and their needs, and as you as an investigator need to focus on the presentation's purpose and also the characteristics of the audience to which you're presenting. And you have to contend with the ability of administrators and policymakers to protect their time and ignore information they don't want. So your investigator, you, need the listeners and the readers to correctly identify the findings and the implied actions. 5-step process that your book goes over. Step 1, identify all possible audiences, perhaps even future audiences. Identify uses of communication and the route it will take, and that would mean oral, written, etc. Identify the audience's concerns and needs, make your communications clear and accessible, and identify arguments and approaches that would be effective with an audience. And there's a nice graphical display there from your textbook that lists those 5 steps. So components of a quantitative report. This includes a summary of the report, discussion of the background, the lit review, description of methodology, and the findings. Recommendations, references, and a bibliography may also be included. And here's a sample table of contents from your textbook, and you notice how it's organized. There's an executive summary. We're going to talk about that in a minute. There's your purpose, your design, your findings, and then things in the appendix might be the research tool, the survey instrument, if you've gotten approval from a human subjects committee, and so forth. And some more things down there in the tables. And again, there's some comments here that some sections that commonly appear doesn't have a background. So this particular report format is not the only type of format that can be used. So the executive summary highlights the report's content, and then intended audiences to an executive with little time to read the entire report. So you want to make sure you include the succinct points that you want to get across in that executive summary. And it's easy to scan and then decide if the executive wants to go ahead and read the whole report. It's the last thing that you write because you have to have the whole report written before you can really come up with an executive summary. And it includes only information in the report. Can be read and understood independently of the report. So example of an executive summary in example 15.2 in your book. To meet accreditation standards, police department must survey citizen attitudes and opinions annually. And there's the methodology. They did a telephone survey randomly selected from the city directory, questions focused on how citizens felt about the department, etc. And so here's the major findings in all the districts, and it goes through the major findings that they had gotten in the report. And so again, the executive with, like say, the police chief or the police commissioner can quickly look and see the results here of what they got from that particular survey. So abstracts are used in journal articles instead of executive summaries, and they have particularly the same purpose and content. Abstracts are generally shorter, usually about 200 words, with highly concise writing. The journal you're submitting to will give you specific instructions on how to put together the abstract and how long it can be. And remember also, when you're doing a literature search through an online search engine, frequently the abstract will show up, and so you want to make sure that it lists everything that's in the paper so that someone may want to go ahead and read the entire paper. And it may include technical jargon, and in addition to prefacing articles, can also here again be reprinted in compilations. So Sage Public Administration abstracts only includes the abstracts within the reference to the particular journal article. So it's important that the abstract be well written. Background information puts the study in context. It's located in the introduction or the review of the literature. Includes a definitive statement of the study's purpose, a history of the problem or source of the question, and then develop background information. To develop it, the researchers would look at interviews, documents, lit review, etc. In applied research report, information from the literature review is woven into the background presentation, assigned to the appendix or the bibliography. And in an academic research, the literature review might appear as a separate section. The literature review establishes the value of the research and how it fits in with other research that's already been conducted. In an academic publication, it demonstrates that the research answers a question not previously investigated or fills in a gap, tests a model under different conditions, corrects for errors in previous research, or resolves conflicting research findings. You're generally not going to publish something that says exactly what another research paper already says. 3 formats of literature review: chronological order, You put things in order. This is best if there's a discrete body of studies that build on one another. You can also do the organization by key variables or concepts. This works best if there are diverse studies examining the same dependent variable. And then concentric circles, where you begin by identifying studies related to the general topic and then move to the literature that generated the specific research question. And this is good for research that's narrowly focused. The methodology section describes the study's measures, the sample, the research design. The measurement section discusses the operational definitions, how numerical values are assigned, any indices that were created, evidence supporting reliability and operation validity. Generally only reports mathematical tests of reliability. The sample section must include the target population, the sampling frame, the design of the sampling, the response rate, how and when the data were collected, the sample size, etc. Statistics comparing respondents and non-respondents should be reported, especially if there was a concern about the response rate. And sources of non-sampling errors should also be discussed. Cross-sectional design, measurement, sampling designs are generally enough. Time series include the beginning, ending time points, frequency of intervals, source of any non-random fluctuation should also be noted. Laboratory experiments require more extensive discussion, how the controls were designed, how the study design controls for threats to internal validity should contain enough detail so that someone else could replicate your study. Researchers should also report any flaws or limitations. The findings are the research results, explicit statement of what was found, the statistical or qualitative evidence to support it. You want to organize your findings into a coherent presentation, focus on important findings and avoid unnecessary detail, and then also decide on how you're going to present the findings, including tables and/or graphs. Background, model, methodology are all presented before the findings in the paper or presentation. So the presentation of findings, the structure helps to focus the audience. Graphs and tables can complement verbal presentation. So you could have a table or a graph on a slide and then be talking about what you're seeing up there by, again, underscoring the important points. And you want to exhibit your data efficiently. You don't want to have a surplus of tables that don't really add to the presentation. The location and amount of space devoted to words or graphics should signal the importance. Detailed discussion of large amounts of data is generally not effective. Careful labeling of tables and graphs is critical. So some tips for data presentation. You have to have titles on all your tables and graphs. The good table supplements the text but doesn't duplicate it. Variables and reported values have to be clearly labeled, including the units. Independent variable generally goes across the columns or the top of the graph or chart, and the dependent along the rows. We've talked about that earlier in the course. Use a percent at the top, avoid unnecessary decimals. So in other words, this is saying don't repeat the percent in every cell of the table. Put the percent at the top of the column where you're reporting a percent. You have to include the total number of cases. That could be a footnote at the bottom of the table. Statistical measures should be listed at the bottom. Any terms open to interpretation should be defined in footnotes below the chart. And the source of the data should also be included in the footnote. In your recommendation sections, these are normative statements about changes that should be made in program or policy based on the research findings. They should be carefully formulated and developed and evaluated during the course of the study. They should naturally follow from the research findings. The costs and the benefits of adopting a recommendation may also be identified. And they may be very useful to include several options. In an oral presentation, administrators may prefer the oral presentation because it allows people to ask questions. The researchers can tailor the presentation to the audience, and social interaction among audience members can also increase the understanding of the results. One-on-one informal discussions could also be useful. An effective presentation requires planning and practice. Research presentation, the traditional order is usually best. Background, methodology, and findings. Visual aids, again, are very useful. Also go back for a second. In the background, you may not do an extensive literature review during a presentation. That would be restricted to being in the written paper. Visual aids are very helpful, but too many can bore the audience. Equipment failures can occur, so you must be prepared to present without your visual aids. Consider the audience when you're selecting your visual aids, and preparation is critical. Anticipate the difficult questions and have answers ready. Poster presentations are common at professional academic conferences. They allow the researcher to interact with an audience. There's generally a time set aside for posters, and the presenter or presenters will stand with their poster, and people will walk around the room and review the posters and chat with the researchers. The poster must quickly portray the subject and catch the eye of the passerby. Has to combine text and graphics to present the research project in a way that's visually interesting and informative. Again, the attendees are walking around and picking which posters they stop at, so you want to make sure you catch their eye with your presentation. There are some tips on page 494 in your text. We also have to consider digital, online, and social media, and many journals are now published online. Sometimes they're only online, or they have online and print versions. In social media, there's a platform to facilitate information exchange between or among users. Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter are most commonly known, and there's also cloud-based services that can serve as repositories for sharing documents. And social media can also be used to conduct research. Briefly, some ethical issues. We talked about these at the end of the last semester, but in 1989 there was a joint study group committee of the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine, and they published a report on responsible science ensuring the integrity of the research process. Social scientists and administrative researchers have not received a similar level of scrutiny. So again, go back to this for a minute. This was focused on medicine and science. This report categorized three inappropriate scientific research categories: research misconduct, questionable research practices, and other misconduct. Let's just talk about what they mean. Misconduct on the research means fabrication. You make up the data or the results. Falsification is changing the data or the results. So notice the difference. Fabrication is you make it up. Falsification, you change. It's an easy way to falsify. One easy way is to drop cases from a data set. If you're dropping cases, you have to explain why. Plagiarism is falsely representing another ideas or words as your own. Again, remember how to quote. And you also must pay attention to copyright laws. You can't just pluck tables and graphs from other people's work. It's easy in the online environment to do that, but you have to pay attention to copyright. Handling research errors. Errors inevitable in research. Mistakes are going to be made. Here's 4 potential sources: accuracy and precision of measurements. Are the experiments generalizable? The quality of the design, and finally the interpretation of the practical significance. If research findings differ from what was expected, the researcher should carefully examine the data. Perhaps there was an error in coding, the data was written down wrong. Explore alternative explanations and report those results. Peer review provides full disclosure of research methods and subjects' work to review by peers, and it's the best way to identify and correct errors. Most peer-reviewed journals nowadays require researchers to submit the raw data along with the paper for publication. And the peer reviewers are specialists who read and review the manuscripts and proposals. They might recommend the research to be published, they might identify weaknesses, they might send it back to the researcher for modifications, or it might just be rejected. A blind review means the reviewer does not know who conducted the research, and the public relies on this peer review process to protect it from flawed research. So some examples of flawed research. In 1993, there was an error in a study for the treatment of HIV. The article appeared in Nature, which is a very prestigious journal. 6 months later, the researchers announced they had misread the lab findings. A columnist in the New York Times cited the error as a failure to the peer review process. Researchers in the UK tried to replicate it, but their results were contrary to what was published. Hot topics can lead researchers to be less careful in their work and push for acceptance because they want to get their paper published first. Another example, there was an article published in 1998 by Andrew Wakefield, and I believe we covered this in Chapter 8 in the first semester. This was the article about the causal link between autism and immunization, and many parents use this article as a reason to decline vaccines for their children. But in 2010, the article was retracted. The sample size was only 12, and Wakefield lied about the children. Most of them had the developmental problems before they actually got vaccinated. And there's a link to the original article. Actually, a link to a news article about the retraction. Saving your data. You have to save your data. Again, if you're going to submit to a journal, you may have to make that data accessible to others. The research report includes the completed data, the collection instruments, procedures, and so forth. And when you write a report, you actually want to include in an appendix the actual raw data. And the guidelines might be those of the employer or the funding agency. In general, we recommend maintaining for at least 5 years after the publication of the results. Confidentiality must also be considered. Again, when we went through ethical considerations in our first course, we talked about informed consent, and this semester we talked about issues with secondary data analysis and consenting. At the end of a study, the researchers have to organize and store the data for the required period, and also the shelf life should be considered. Completed questionnaires should be consulted for data errors if you come up with something during the analysis. You want to make sure you keep the data dictionary so people understand the code, if there's any coding with your data. So in summary, before presenting your findings, researchers should identify the audience, and the presentation should be tailored for that particular audiences. Oral presentations involve a captive audience as compared to a written publication where people can read it at their own leisure. It's important to practice before an oral presentation, and you make sure your visual aids are easy to see and interpret. Researchers have to adhere to ethical practices, peer review, an important aspect of ethical practice and research, and confidentiality and research data must be maintained and the confidentiality respected.